The fluorescent lights hummed a constant, low note, the only sound in the otherwise silent gas station. Outside, the Jacksonville night had settled in, thick and heavy with humidity that fogged the edges of the glass doors. I wiped down the counter for the third time, not because it was dirty, but because the motion was a comfort, a small, predictable ritual in the long, empty hours of the night shift. The smell of stale coffee and cleaning fluid was the permanent scent of my world. From behind the counter, the aisles of brightly colored snacks and drinks looked like a strange, silent audience. Headlights would occasionally sweep across the parking lot, a brief flare of hope for a customer, for something to do, before they continued on their way, leaving me alone with the hum again. I was 22. Most nights I thought about the things I should be doing instead. I'd think about unfinished college applications, about the car I wanted to fix up, about the feel of the sun on my skin at the beach. This job was a means to an end, a temporary stop. That's what I told myself, a series of temporary stops that were beginning to feel permanent. The bell above the door chimed, a tinny electronic sound that cut through the low drone of the lights. A man walked in. He wasn't big or imposing, just an ordinary man in a dark hoodie and jeans. He moved with a kind of deliberate slowness, his eyes scanning the store, not like a customer looking for a specific item, but like someone taking inventory. He lingered by the coolers, his back to me. I watched him in the small, convex security mirror mounted in the corner. His reflection was distorted, curved. I felt a familiar, low-level caution that always came with late-night customers. You learn to read people, to notice the small things, the way they walk, the way they avoid eye contact, the tension in their shoulders. Something about him felt off. He wasn't browsing, he was waiting. He finally turned and walked toward the counter, grabbing a bag of chips from a rack as he approached. It was a casual gesture, meant to look normal, but it felt rehearsed. He placed the chips on the counter. "That all for you?" I asked, my voice flat. He didn't answer, he just looked at me. His eyes were flat, empty of anything but a hard, direct purpose. The air between us grew thick and still. He lifted his shirt just enough for me to see the dark metal of a handgun tucked into his waistband. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, it was quiet, matter of fact, a statement. My breath caught in my chest. The world seemed to shrink to the space between us, to the worn laminate of the counter and the piece of metal under his shirt. The hum of the lights grew louder in my ears. My training kicked in, a series of robotic instructions I had heard in a stuffy back room months ago. Do not resist, comply. Your life is not worth the money in the register. I raised my hands slowly, palms open, a universal gesture of surrender. "Okay," I said. The word came out as a quiet rasp. "Okay, just be calm." He said nothing, he just watched my face, his expression unchanging. His silence was worse than any shouted demand. It was a cold, empty space that my own fear rushed to fill. He gestured with his head toward the register. I understood. My hands felt slow, disconnected from my brain. I turned, my movements stiff and measured. I pressed the sequence of buttons to open the drawer. The machine made its usual electronic whir, followed by the mechanical slide of the cash drawer opening. The sound was horribly loud in the silent store. I pulled out the bills, 20s, 10s, 5s, 1s. It wasn't much. It was never much on the night shift. I laid the small stacks of cash on the counter, careful not to make any sudden movements. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I could feel sweat trickling down my back, cold against my skin. I focused on the money, on the worn faces of presidents, on anything but the man and the gun. I slid the money across the counter toward him. He scooped it up with one hand, his eyes never leaving me. He stuffed the cash into his pocket. For a moment I thought it was over. He had what he came for. He would leave and I would be left standing here, shaking but alive. I could already feel the wave of relief preparing to wash over me. But he didn't leave, he just stood there watching me. The silence stretched on, thin and brittle. What else did he want? The safe was on a time lock. I couldn't open it even if I wanted to. I tried to communicate that with my eyes, to show him there was nothing left. I saw his gaze flicker past me, toward the cigarette display behind my back. Then his eyes came back to mine. They narrowed slightly. A new kind of coldness entered them, something beyond the simple calculus of a robbery. It was something personal, something final. I don't know what he saw in my face. Fear, pleading. Maybe he saw me as a loose end, a witness who could describe him to the police. Maybe he just didn't care. The logic of it didn't matter. All that mattered was the sudden shift in his posture, the way his hand moved from his pocket back to his waistband. He raised the gun. It wasn't like in the movies. There was no dramatic clicking sound, no tense standoff. It was just a smooth, economical motion. One moment his hand was empty, the next it was holding the weapon, pointing it directly at my chest. My entire existence compressed into that single point in time. The bright, sterile light of the store, the colorful rows of candy bars on the shelf next to me, the reflection of my own terrified face in the plexiglass divider. Everything was sharp and clear, etched into my memory. There was no sound, only the overwhelming presence of that dark circle at the end of the barrel. I thought of my mother. I thought of how I never finished that college application. I thought of how stupid it was to die over a few $100s in a gas station. A hard, violent punch slammed into my shoulder. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling, a physical blow that threw me backward. My body hit the cigarette display, and the flimsy metal shelves buckled under my weight. Packs of cigarettes rained down around me as I slid to the floor. For a moment there was no pain, just a profound sense of shock and confusion. I was on the floor, my left arm felt numb, useless. I looked up and saw him standing there, his face unreadable. Then he turned and walked out the door. He didn't run, he just walked. The bell chimed again, announcing his departure. Then I was alone. The silence that returned was different. It was heavy, suffocating. The hum of the light seemed distant. A warm, wet sensation was spreading across my chest and down my side. I looked down. My blue work shirt was turning a dark, glistening red. That's when the pain arrived. It started as a deep, burning throb in my shoulder and quickly consumed my entire awareness. It was a white-hot fire, so intense it made it hard to breathe. Every beat of my heart sent a fresh wave of agony through me. The world began to feel tilted, unreal. The linoleum floor was cold against my cheek. I could smell the dust from under the counter, mixed with something else, a coppery, metallic scent that I knew was my own blood. My vision started to blur at the edges. The bright colors of the snack aisle swam together. I had to do something. The thought was a small, flickering light in a fog of pain and shock. The phone, the panic button, they were on the counter just above me. It felt miles away. I tried to push myself up with my good arm. A fresh explosion of pain seared through my chest, and I collapsed back onto the floor with a gasp. My head swam. The darkness at the edge of my vision crept closer. No, I couldn't pass out. If I passed out, I would die here on the sticky floor of this gas station. I began to crawl. I dragged my body across the floor with my right arm, my useless left side trailing behind me. Each movement was a monumental effort, sending jolts of agony through my body. The floor tiles were a grid I measured my progress against, one tile, then another. The spilled packs of cigarettes crinkled under my body. I reached the inside of the counter. I could see the bottom of the register, the tangled mess of wires for the credit card machine. I rested my head against the cool particle board of the cabinet, my breath coming in shallow, ragged pants. I could hear a faint wheezing sound and realized it was me. Above me, under the lip of the counter, was the small, red panic button. It was a simple, plastic circle. I had looked at it 1,000 times and never thought I would use it. It was for a situation just like this, a situation I never truly believed would happen to me. With the last of my strength, I reached up. My fingers felt clumsy and weak. They brushed against the cool plastic. I pushed. There was no sound, no confirmation that it had worked. I didn't know if it sent a silent alarm, if lights were flashing at a dispatch center somewhere, or if it was just a dead piece of plastic. I had to believe it worked. I let my arm fall back to the floor. There was nothing left to do. I lay there, listening to the hum of the lights and the sound of my own labored breathing. The pool of blood around me was growing larger. I felt cold, so incredibly cold, despite the thick Florida air. I closed my eyes. The face of the man appeared in my mind, not his whole face, just his eyes, flat and empty. I wondered if he was already miles away, counting the money. I wondered if he thought about me at all. The hum of the lights was starting to fade. The world was getting quiet. I thought I heard a distant siren, but it could have been a ringing in my own ears. I focused on the feeling of the cold floor against my skin. It was real. It was solid. As long as I could feel it, I was still here. Then through the glass doors I saw them, flashing lights, red and blue, painting the interior of the store in silent, strobing bursts. The colors washed over the candy bar wrappers, the soda coolers, and the dark stain on the floor. They were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Shadowy figures moved outside the door, voices muffled at first, then clearer. The sound of the glass door being forced open, heavy boots on the floor. A man in a uniform knelt beside me. He was saying something, but the words were a blur. I felt a hand on my good shoulder, a firm, grounding pressure. I was no longer alone. The darkness receded just a little. I was lying on the floor of a gas station, bleeding and in more pain than I could have imagined, but I was alive. I was breathing, and for now, that was everything. The air inside the rig was thick, a recycled soup of antiseptic, stale coffee, and the humid July night pressing in from outside. It was a standard Florida summer evening, so heavy you could feel it on your skin. Kayla was in the passenger seat, scrolling through something on her phone, the screen casting a pale blue light across her face. Her expression was neutral, the look of someone passing the endless, syrupy minutes of a slow night shift. We rarely spoke during these lulls. There was nothing left to say that we hadn't already said over 100 other nights just like this one. We knew each other's rhythms, the way she would meticulously restock the cabinets after a run, the way I always drove a little too fast. It was a partnership born of shared exhaustion and the unspoken understanding of what we saw on a daily basis. I watched the palm fronds sway under the orange glow of a streetlight. A car passed, its headlights cutting a brief, bright swath through our darkened cab before disappearing, leaving us in the quiet again. The radio was a low, intermittent squawk of codes and static, the city's restless heartbeat. My own was slow and steady. This was the job, mostly waiting. A long, dull wait punctuated by moments of pure adrenaline. Tonight was all wait. Then the radio crackled with our unit number. A wellness check, an address in a part of town where the streetlights were sparse and the houses sat further back from the road, hidden by overgrown yards. Not an emergency, not a lights and sirens call, just a quiet drive into a quieter part of the city. Kayla put her phone away, her movements efficient and practiced. She confirmed the call, her voice calm and clear over the radio. I put the rig in drive and pulled away from the curb, the heavy vehicle groaning as it moved. The streets were empty. It felt like we were the only two people awake in the entire world. The address led us down a narrow street lined with dark, silent houses. Our headlights swept across peeling paint and chain-link fences. It was hard to see the numbers on the mailboxes. I slowed the ambulance to a crawl. "Should be on the left," she said, her voice low. She was leaning forward, peering through the windshield. I pulled over where the GPS told us to stop. There was no house, just an empty lot overgrown with weeds and littered with debris. A single tall pine tree stood in the center, a dark silhouette against the faintly lighter sky. It felt wrong. "I'll check the next block," I said. "Maybe the numbering is off." I left the engine running, the lights on. The air that hit me when I opened the door was like a wet blanket. The sound of cicadas was a constant, high-pitched thrum. I walked a few paces down the cracked sidewalk, my boots crunching on loose gravel. The houses on the other side of the street were dark, no lights in the windows, no cars in the driveways. A deep sense of unease began to creep up my spine. This wasn't right. Calls like this were strange, but this felt different. It was the stillness. The absolute lack of life. I turned back toward the rig. The big white box looked alien under the moonlight, its running lights casting a soft, steady glow on the asphalt. I could see Kayla's silhouette in the passenger seat. She had turned, probably to look at the laptop mounted between the seats. That's when the sound came. It wasn't loud, not like in the movies. It was a sharp, percussive crack that split the night air for a fraction of a second, then vanished. My first thought was a firecracker. My second was that a tire had blown. I stood frozen for a moment, listening to the cicadas, which had never stopped their song. Then I saw the glass. A spiderweb pattern had bloomed on the passenger side window of the ambulance. A dark hole was at its center. A cold, heavy thing dropped into my stomach. I ran. My legs felt disconnected from my body, but they moved, pumping hard against the pavement. The short distance back to the rig felt like miles. I wrenched the driver's side door open and scrambled inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Kayla." She didn't answer. She was slumped against the door, her head at an odd angle. The blue light from her phone was still on, lying on the floor mat, illuminating a dark stain spreading across the front of her uniform. I reached for her, my training taking over. I checked for a pulse, my fingers pressing against her neck. There was nothing, just the warm, still skin. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing. The world outside the ambulance seemed to fade away. The hum of the engine, the chirping of the insects, the distant city glow, it all receded into a dull, muffled roar in my ears. All I could see was the shattered glass on her lap and the vacant look in her eyes. I had been standing a few yards away. I had heard the sound, but I hadn't seen anything. No car, no person, nothing, just the empty, silent street. I grabbed the radio, my hand shaking so badly I could barely key the mic. I don't remember what I said. I think I just screamed our location and that my partner was down. that an officer was needed, that we needed everyone. The wait for the sirens was the longest period of my life. I sat there in the driver's seat, the dome light I had switched on bathing the cab in a harsh, clinical glare. I looked at Kayla. She was 22 years old. We had talked about her plans to go to nursing school earlier that evening. Now she was just gone, snatched out of the world in a single, violent moment on a forgotten street. When the flashing blue and red lights finally arrived, they flooded the cab, painting everything in frantic, strobing colors. Doors slammed. Voices shouted. I was pulled out of the rig, hands grabbing my arms. I was a witness, but I was also a variable, the only other person on the scene. The questions began almost immediately, right there on the side of the road. Where was I standing? What did I see? What did I hear? Did we have an argument? Was there anyone else she was seeing? The questions were a blur, a barrage of words that I tried to answer through a thick fog of shock. They took my weapon, a small pistol I was licensed to carry and kept locked in my gear bag. They took my clothes. They swabbed my hands for residue. The hours that followed were spent in a small, cold room at the police station. The coffee they gave me tasted like ash. I sat on a hard plastic chair while different detectives came in and out, asking the same questions in slightly different ways. Their faces were impassive, but I could see the suspicion in their eyes. It made sense. In these situations, the partner is always the first place they look. I was the last person with her. My grief was a raw, open wound, yet I had to defend myself, to walk them through the mundane minutes leading up to the single, horrific second that changed everything. I told them about the empty lot, about my walk down the block. I told them about the sound. They held me for a long time. They let me go in the early hours of the morning when the sky was starting to turn a bruised purple. They told me not to leave town. The world outside the station felt alien. The sun was rising on a day that Kayla would never see. The next few weeks were a living nightmare. My name was in the papers, my face on the local news. I was the person of interest. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors would turn away when I walked to my car. I was treated like a ghost in my own life. I was grieving my partner, my friend, and at the same time I was the prime suspect in her murder. The two feelings warred inside me, a toxic combination of sorrow and rage. I would lie awake at night, replaying those few minutes over and over. The walk. The sound, the shattered glass. I would search for a detail I had missed, a flicker of movement in the shadows, the glint of something in the dark. There was nothing. Then one day my lawyer called. The lab results had come back. The ballistics didn't match my firearm. The residue tests on my hands were negative. There was nothing to physically tie me to what happened. Reluctantly, publicly, they cleared my name. But it didn't matter. The suspicion never fully washed away, and even if it had, it wouldn't have changed anything. Kayla was still gone, her killer was still out there. The police had no leads. The call had been a fake, a lure, but for who and why nobody knew. It was a random act of violence, a hole blasted into the fabric of the world with no reason and no explanation. I never went back to work. I couldn't sit in the passenger seat of an ambulance again. I couldn't drive down a dark street at night without my hands clenching the steering wheel, my eyes scanning the shadows. The sound of a car backfiring would send a jolt of ice through my veins. I moved away from Fort Myers a year later. I work in a warehouse now, stocking shelves. The work is monotonous, physical, and blessedly quiet. It requires nothing from my mind. I live in a small apartment. I don't talk to many people. Sometimes, late in the evening, I'll see an ambulance pass on the street below, its lights flashing but its siren silent. I'll watch until its taillights disappear, and for a moment I'm back on that dark, empty road. I can feel the oppressive humidity on my skin and hear the unending song of the cicadas. I see the spiderweb of cracks on the window and the pale blue glow of a phone on the floor, and I am left with the same question that has haunted every waking moment since that night. Who was out there in the darkness, and why? The air hung thick and heavy, the kind of Georgia summer heat that clings to your skin long after the sun has surrendered. I eased my rig into an open spot at the back of the lot. The hiss of the air breaks a sigh of relief that echoed my own. The low, constant thrum of dozens of idling engines was the lullaby of this life, a mechanical heartbeat in the deep of the night. Sodium lamps cast a sick yellow glow over the asphalt, turning the polished chrome of my grille into a dull, jaundiced metal. I cut the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden, relative silence. The cab was my whole world out here, a bunk, a small fridge, the lingering scent of stale coffee and diesel. My reflection in the dark windshield was a ghost, a tired man with tired eyes, just one of thousands crisscrossing the country while the rest of it slept. After checking the locks, I swung down from the cab. My boots crunched on loose gravel. A few rows over, another driver was doing his pre-sleep walk-around, his flashlight beam cutting a nervous path across his tires. We gave each other the slow, barely perceptible nod that passes for a greeting in these places. We were solitary creatures by trade, sharing a concrete wilderness. I saw the man they would later call Wayne Johnson. He was parked a few spots down from the main building, his rig a clean, late-model Peterbilt, the kind that showed pride. He was on the phone, leaning against his front wheel. I couldn't hear his words, just the low murmur of his voice. He had a soft, rounded look to him, the kind of man you picture grilling in his backyard on a Sunday afternoon, not wrestling a ton of steel down I-85. He laughed at something said on the other end of the line, a quiet, genuine sound that was quickly swallowed by the drone of the refrigerators. He looked content. He looked like he was just minutes away from climbing into his bunk and dreaming of home. I walked past, heading for the travel center. The inside was an oasis of aggressive brightness and recycled air. A couple of clerks moved with the slow, deliberate pace of those who have seen too many dawns from behind a counter. I grabbed a lukewarm coffee and a packaged sandwich that tasted like cardboard and regret. I didn't linger. The forced cheerfulness of these places always felt more draining than the long hours on the road. Back outside, the night had deepened. The man with the Peterbilt had finished his call. His cab was dark now, the curtains drawn. He was done for the day, settled in for the night. I did my own checks, kicking the tires, making sure the seals on the trailer were intact. Everything was as it should be. The routine was a comfort, a small set of rituals to ward off the vast, unpredictable emptiness of the road. I climbed back into my own cab, the door closing with a solid thud. I drew my own curtains, sealing myself into my little metal box. Sleep didn't come easy. It rarely did on the first night of a long haul. Every distant noise, every shift in the air pressure as another truck rolled past was a minor disturbance. I lay there, listening to the symphony of the truck stop, my mind drifting over the miles ahead. That's when I heard it. It wasn't loud, not in a place filled with the roar of engines. It was a flat, sharp report that cut through the bass notes of the idling trucks, a sound that didn't belong. My first thought was a backfire, a blown tire on the interstate nearby, but this was different. It was closer, drier. It was a sound with a hard, ugly edge. I sat up, listening. The world outside my curtains went on unchanged. The engines still hummed. No one shouted. No alarms went off. I told myself I had imagined it or misheard it. The mind plays tricks on you when you're tired. I lay back down, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin and forced my eyes shut. The first hint of trouble came with the morning light. It wasn't the gentle gray of dawn I was used to, but a fractured, strobing blue and red that sliced through the thin gap in my curtains. I pushed the fabric aside and squinted. 2 police cruisers were parked at an angle beside the Peterbilt, the man's truck. An ambulance was there too, its own lights off, sitting with a quiet, ominous patience. A small crowd of drivers had gathered near the fuel pumps, watching, speaking in low tones. No one got too close. A perimeter of yellow tape was already being unspooled, creating a sterile box around the truck, turning it from a home on wheels into a piece of evidence. I dressed quickly and climbed down. The morning air was already sticky, but a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I joined the periphery of the watching drivers. The words came in fragments, passed from one man to the next like a contagion. Heard he was shot. Right in his cab. Robbery, they're saying. Someone just opened his door and... The rest of the sentence hung in the air. We all knew how it ended. We all knew how vulnerable we were, sleeping just feet from strangers, separated from the world by a thin piece of metal and a simple lock. I looked at the Peterbilt, now an object of morbid curiosity. The driver's side door was slightly ajar. A police officer was taking pictures. Another was talking to the night clerk, who looked pale and shaken under the fluorescent lights of the fuel island canopy. I thought of the man on the phone, his quiet laugh. Had he been talking to his wife, his kids? Had he said, "I love you and see you in a few days," just moments before his life was extinguished for the contents of his wallet? The questions were a lead weight in my stomach. The sandwich I'd eaten hours before churned. We were told to stay put. The police wanted to talk to everyone. A detective, a man with the same tired eyes as the rest of us, came around with a notepad. He asked me if I'd seen or heard anything unusual during the night. I told him about the sound, the flat report. I tried to place it in time, but the hours of the night blend together out here. It was just in the dark. He wrote it down without expression. Did you see anyone near that truck? I shook my head. Just the driver. He was on his phone when I walked by. The detective nodded, his gaze sweeping over my face, then my rig, before moving on to the next driver. I felt like a ghost, an unimportant witness to a tragedy that had unfolded just 100 feet from where I slept. My small piece of information felt useless, a single drop in an ocean of darkness. Hours passed, the sun climbed, beating down on the asphalt. The medical examiner's van arrived and left. They brought the man out on a gurney covered by a white sheet. It was a small, anonymous shape. The vibrant, living person from the night before was gone, reduced to a logistical problem, an item to be transported and processed. His beautiful rig, his source of pride and livelihood, sat silent and empty, the yellow tape a final, profane insult. By midday, they started letting us go. One by one, the trucks rumbled to life and pulled out, the drivers careful not to look too long at the scene as they passed. When it was my turn, I fired up my engine, the familiar vibration a hollow comfort. I did my checks out of habit, my mind elsewhere. As I rolled toward the exit, I looked at the Peterbilt one last time. Its curtains were still drawn, as if its owner were still sleeping peacefully inside. The highway stretched out before me, a ribbon of gray disappearing into the heat haze. The world outside the truck stop was oblivious. Cars sped past, families on vacation, commuters heading to their 9-to-5 jobs. They didn't know that a man's life had been taken for pocket money in the yellow light of a place they only saw as a blur from the fast lane. For the rest of that day and for many days after, I drove in silence. I kept the radio off. The easy camaraderie of the CB felt alien. Every truck stop I pulled into felt different, the shadows in the back lot seeming longer, darker. I found myself watching the other drivers, the people moving in the periphery, with a new suspicion. I saw the man on the phone in every face. I heard that flat, ugly sound in every backfire, every dropped piece of cargo. It could have been me, that was the thought that kept circling, a vulture in my mind. The killer had walked through that lot, past my truck, past a dozen others. He had chosen one door over another for reasons I would never know. Random chance, bad luck. I had slept through a man's murder, and my only contribution was the vague memory of a sound. I delivered my load and picked up another, the great cycle of commerce continuing without a pause. But something had been broken in me on that hot Georgia night. The solitude of the road, once a peaceful companion, now felt like a profound and dangerous isolation. I was still a ghost in the machine, a tired man with tired eyes, but now I knew just how quickly and quietly a ghost can be made. The case, they said on the news a week later, was going cold. No suspects, no leads. Just another life erased in the night shift. The coffee was bitter the way I liked it. It was the only thing with any real character in the deep hours of the night shift. Everything else was a muted, fluorescent hum. The vending machine in the corner, the ice maker down the hall, the ballast in the light fixtures overhead. A symphony of low-grade appliances, the soundtrack to my life after midnight. For 9 years, this was my world, the front desk of a red roof in off the interstate in Columbus. A little kingdom of linoleum, cheap art bolted to the walls, and the persistent smell of institutional air freshener. I was 59, an age where you either have a life you've built or a collection of routines you've settled into. Mine was the latter. I was an auditor. I audited the day's receipts, balanced the books, and prepared the reports for the morning manager. It was a job for a quiet man, a man who didn't mind the solitude, who found a strange comfort in the predictable emptiness of a sleeping hotel. The guests were all checked in, tucked away in their identical rooms. The only traffic was the occasional long-haul trucker looking for a room in the dead of night, or a family whose car had broken down. Mostly, it was just me and the hum. That night in February was no different. The cold was a physical presence outside the plate glass doors. It pressed against the building, made the windows weep with condensation. I'd watch the headlights of the sparse traffic on the highway, distant and silent like ghosts on their own journeys. I ran the numbers, my pen scratching across the ledger. The figures had to match. They always did. It was a simple puzzle, and solving it passed the time until the sky began to gray in the east. I finished the audit and pushed the papers aside. The lobby was still, a perfect diorama of transient life. A stack of local tourism pamphlets sat untouched. The coffee in my mug had grown cool. I stood up, stretched my back, and walked a slow circuit around the front desk area. My reflection in the dark glass was a pale, tired man I barely recognized. The company polo shirt was a little tight around the middle. The name tag read Dave. The automatic doors slid open. The sound was abrupt in the silence, a sudden rush of mechanical movement. A blast of frigid air swirled in, carrying the scent of asphalt and ice. A man stood there, framed for a moment against the blackness of the parking lot. He was not a trucker. He was not part of a family. He was thin, wired, wearing a jacket that was no match for the Ohio winter. He stepped inside and the doors slid closed behind him, sealing us in together. He didn't look at me. His eyes darted around the empty lobby, taking in the fake plants, the check-in counter, the hallway leading to the rooms. He was a predator assessing a new hunting ground. There was a stillness to him that was more unsettling than any frantic energy. I've seen men high, drunk, desperate. This was something else. This was a hollowed-out purpose. I remained behind the counter, my hands resting on the worn laminate. My training, a half-remembered video I'd watched years ago, clicked into place. Be calm, be compliant, do not make any sudden moves. He finally looked at me. His eyes were flat, devoid of light. He walked toward the desk, his footsteps soft on the tiled floor. He didn't speak. He just came closer, each step deliberate, closing the small distance of empty space between us. I could see the chapped skin on his lips, the way his jaw was set. My heart was no longer a steady background rhythm. It was a frantic drumming against my ribs, but on the outside I was a statue. I was Dave, the night auditor, a fixture in this quiet world. I waited. He stopped at the counter. The air between us was thick with unspoken things. I could smell stale cigarette smoke on his clothes. He placed his hands on the counter, his fingers drumming a silent, irregular beat. Then he looked down at the cash register. His gaze was all the communication I needed. I nodded slowly. I kept my own hands in sight, raising them slightly before turning to the register. This was just money. It was insured. It wasn't worth my life. My life was my wife sleeping at home, the smell of her shampoo on the pillow next to me. It was my daughter in college, the tuition bills I paid without complaint. It was the simple, quiet pleasure of watching the sun rise at the end of a long shift. This drawer of paper and metal was nothing compared to that. The key turned in the lock. The drawer sprang open with a soft, mechanical sound. I reached in, my fingers clumsy, and began to pull out the bills. 5s, 10s, 20s, not much. There never was on the night shift. He was impatient. He leaned further over the counter, his presence a dark cloud. I could feel the cold radiating off his thin jacket. I didn't look up at his face. I focused on the task, on the crisp feel of the money, on getting it out and into his hands so he would leave and let the silence return. But he didn't wait. In one fluid motion, he was over the counter. He vaulted the barrier that separated my world from the rest of the lobby. It was so fast, so silent. One moment he was on the other side, the next he was next to me, inside my sanctuary of ledgers and routine. The smell of him was stronger now, an acrid mix of sweat and cold. I stumbled back, my legs hitting the chair behind me. My hands came up, an instinctual gesture of defense. It was a mistake, it was a challenge. I saw the glint of metal first, a brief flash under the fluorescent lights. It wasn't a gun, it was something smaller, more intimate, a knife. The blade was not long, but it looked brutally sharp. My mind didn't have time to process fear. It went into a state of pure animal shock. The world compressed into the space between us. The hum of the hotel faded away. There was only him, his flat eyes, and the object in his hand. He lunged. The first sensation was not pain. It was a hard, shocking pressure in my side, a forceful punch that took my breath away. I thought he had just hit me. Then a strange, spreading warmth bloomed under my shirt. I looked down. The handle of the knife was protruding from my ribs. My polo shirt was turning a dark, wet red. The reality of the situation crashed down on me. This was not a simple robbery. I fell back, the chair rolling away as I collapsed against the wall of cubbies behind the desk. The impact jarred my whole body. The blade moved inside me, and a wave of searing, white-hot agony washed over me. I gasped, but no sound came out. My lungs refused to work. He stood over me, his expression unchanged. He pulled the knife free. The motion was sickening, a wet, tearing finality. I slid down the wall, my legs no longer able to support me. He leaned down, not to check on me, but to reach into the open cash drawer. His movements were quick, efficient. He scooped up the bills, stuffing them into his jacket pocket. I lay on the floor on my side. The world was tilting. My cheek was pressed against the cold, industrial-grade carpet. I could see the dust bunnies under the desk, the scuff marks on the baseboards. The details were so sharp, so clear. My breathing was a ragged, shallow thing. Each breath was a new mountain of pain. He finished with the drawer and turned to go. He stepped over my legs as if I were a piece of discarded luggage. He didn't look back. I listened to his soft footsteps cross the lobby. The automatic doors slid open again, letting in another wave of cold air. Then they closed. And the silence returned. But it was a different silence now. It was heavy, suffocating. It was filled with the sound of my own blood pooling on the carpet, the frantic, useless beat of my own heart. I was alone again, but the solitude was no longer a comfort, it was a death sentence. A thought clear as a bell cut through the fog of pain. The phone was on the counter just above my head. It seemed a million miles away. I tried to push myself up. A fire erupted in my side, so intense it made my vision swim with black spots. I fell back, a weak groan escaping my lips. I couldn't give up. I thought of my wife's face. The way she smiled when I brought her coffee in the morning. I had to see that smile again. My arm felt like it was filled with lead. I reached up, my fingers scraping against the laminate edge of the counter. I missed. I took a breath, a shallow, painful gasp, and tried again. This time my fingers found a hold. I pulled. My body screamed in protest. The world spun, but I kept pulling. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, I dragged myself up. The phone cord was dangling just within reach. I stretched my fingers, my muscles screaming. I snagged it. The receiver felt impossibly heavy. I pulled it down off its cradle. It clattered to the floor beside my head. My fingers were slick with my own blood. They wouldn't work properly. I fumbled with the keypad, trying to see the numbers through the haze. 9, my finger slipped. I tried again. 1, another slip. Come on, Dave, just one more. 1. I pressed the last digit and let my hand fall. I put the receiver to my ear. I heard the electronic tone, then the voice of a dispatcher, a calm, female voice. 911, what is your emergency? I tried to speak, but my throat was clogged. A wet, gurgling sound was all that came out. Sir, are you there? I have your location at the Red Roof Inn. Is someone injured? I focused all my remaining energy. I pressed the receiver hard against my mouth. Help, I whispered. The word was a ghost of a sound. Stabbed. That was all I could manage. The effort cost me everything I had left. The receiver slipped from my grasp. The world was going soft at the edges, the fluorescent lights turning into blurry halos. The hum of the hotel was fading, replaced by a rushing sound in my ears. I closed my eyes. The cold from the floor was seeping into my bones. This is it, I thought. This is how it ends. In a cheap hotel lobby, surrounded by the smell of bitter coffee and my own blood, a quiet man meeting a loud and violent end. But then somewhere in the distance I heard another sound, a new sound cutting through the night, a siren, faint at first then growing louder, closer, a sound of hope in the vast, indifferent darkness. My consciousness flickered. I saw flashes, bright lights flooding the lobby, heavy boots on the floor, voices urgent and professional, hands on me not violent but firm, assessing, the feeling of being lifted, of movement, the cold night air on my face, sharp and real, the inside of an ambulance, a face looming over me telling me to stay with them. I held onto that voice. I held onto the thought of my wife's smile. I held onto the sunrise I was determined to see again. I didn't let go. I fought the encroaching darkness with every last ounce of will I had. I survived. They told me later it was a miracle. The knife had missed my major organs by millimeters. I spent weeks in the hospital, a place with its own set of night shift hums and rhythms. They caught him. His name was Michael, no relation, just a random man, a ghost who had drifted into my life and tried to extinguish it for a handful of cash. I never went back to the night shift. I couldn't. The silence is different for me now. It's no longer a comfort. It's a space where anything can happen. Sometimes when I'm awake in the deep hours of the night, I can still smell the stale cigarette smoke and feel the impossible cold of that February air. I can feel the phantom pressure in my side. I survived, but a part of that quiet man named Dave died on the floor of that lobby. The man who came out of the hospital is someone else. Someone who understands that a life isn't just a collection of routines. It's a fragile, precious thing that can be torn apart in the space between one breath and the next. The cold seeped through the thin walls of the guard shack, a damp Bay Area chill that found its way into your bones. Mike didn't seem to notice. He sat hunched over the small table, a worn thermos of coffee between his hands, his gaze fixed on the bank of grainy black and white monitors. At 57, he moved with a deliberate slowness that I mistook for weariness at first. I learned later it was just efficiency, a conservation of energy for a job that was 99% boredom and 1% terror. He was a good man to work with, quiet. He didn't feel the need to fill the silence with pointless chatter. He taught me the rhythms of the night shift, the groan of the generator, the distant hum of the freeway, the way the shadows of the skeletal high-rise stretched and warped under the harsh floodlights. He called me kid, but not in a way that made me feel small. It was just a fact. I was young and he was not. The site was a maze of rebar, stacked lumber, and half-poured concrete foundations. Mud was a constant, a thick, greedy substance that sucked at our boots with every step. Our job was simple: keep people out. Mostly it was teenagers looking for a place to drink or the homeless seeking shelter from the wind that swept in from the water. Mike handled them all the same way, with a firm but tired voice that offered no room for argument. He never raised it. He never had to. That evening started like any other. We walked the perimeter, the chain-link fence rattling softly in the breeze. Mike ran his flashlight along the locks on the main gate, a ritual he performed with the solemnity of a priest. We checked the heavy equipment, the hulking yellow beasts silent and sleeping in the darkness. We made sure the tool containers were secure. Everything was as it should be. Back in the shack, the hours crawled by. The little electric heater clicked and whirred, fighting a losing battle against the December cold. I watched the monitors, my eyes glazing over from the static-laced images of empty corridors and dark corners. Mike read a paperback novel, its cover creased and soft from use. The silence was comfortable. It was the sound of another uneventful night. That's the thing about this job: you pray for uneventful. You learn to love the drone of machinery and the predictable silence, because the alternative is something you don't want to consider. It was Mike who heard it first. He didn't flinch or jump. He just lifted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. He tilted his head, listening to something beyond the shack's thin walls. I hadn't heard a thing. "What is it?" I asked, my voice low. He held up a hand, silencing me. He stood up, his joints making a soft protest, and moved to the door. He opened it just a crack, letting in a sliver of frigid air. We stood there for what felt like a long time, listening to the night. I could only hear the wind and the freeway, but Mike heard something else. He had been doing this for 30 years. His ears were tuned to the wrong notes in the symphony of the night. "Something back by the east containers," he said, his voice a low rumble. He pulled on his heavy jacket. "Stay here, watch the cameras." I didn't argue, but I didn't stay put. I watched him on the monitor for the east perimeter, a grainy figure moving with purpose through the pools of light and shadow. He held his heavy flashlight like a club, not a light source. He disappeared behind a stack of drywall, and the camera's view was blocked. My heart began to beat a little faster. The silence in the shack suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. Minutes passed. He didn't reappear. My own protocol, the one drilled into me during a 2-week training course, was clear. Stay in the secure location. Call the police. Do not engage. But Mike was out there. He was my partner. I grabbed my own flashlight and jacket and stepped out of the shack. The cold hit me like a physical blow. The air smelled of wet earth and diesel. I followed the path he took, my boots sinking into the mud. The sight seemed different now, the shadows deeper, the familiar shapes of equipment now menacing and alien. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. Every clatter of loose sheet metal sounded like a footstep. I found the fence first. A section of the chain link near the back where the floodlights didn't quite reach had been cut. A neat, wide opening. My stomach tightened. This wasn't kids, this was professional. I clicked off my flashlight, my eyes straining to adjust to the gloom. I crept forward, using the stacks of materials for cover. The main tool and equipment containers were just ahead, huge steel boxes that held tens of thousands of dollars in portable generators, power tools, and copper wiring. I heard the sound then, the one Mike had heard, a low metallic scrape, then a muffled voice. My blood ran cold. I flattened myself behind a pallet of concrete bags, my breath catching in my throat. I peered through a gap. 2 men, they were dressed in dark clothes, their faces obscured by hoods and shadows. They had a bolt cutter and were working on the lock of the largest container. A flatbed truck, its engine off, was parked nearby in a deep shadow, almost invisible. Where was Mike? My mind raced. I should go back, I should call for help. But my feet were rooted to the spot, my body paralyzed by a cold, primal fear. Then I saw him. He was using the darkness, moving along the edge of the light's reach, circling around them. He was trying to get between them and their truck. It was a classic move, cutting off their escape. It was also incredibly dangerous. He stepped out from behind a bulldozer. "That's far enough," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the night with absolute authority. It was the same tired, firm voice he used on everyone. The 2 men froze. They turned slowly, like figures in a bad dream. For a moment, nobody moved. The wind howled through the unfinished floors of the building above us. One of the men held the bolt cutters. The other had his hands in his pockets. "Drop it," Mike said, his flashlight beam pinning the man with the cutters. "Police are on their way. We can do this easy." It happened so fast I almost didn't process it. The second man, the one with his hands in his pockets, pulled his hand out. It wasn't empty. There was a flash, a deafening crack that echoed off the concrete and steel. Mike staggered back a step, a dark stain bloomed on the front of his jacket. He didn't make a sound, he just looked down at his chest, a look of surprise on his face. Then his legs gave out and he fell. He landed heavily in the mud. The world seemed to slow down. The sound of the shot was still ringing in my ears. The two men stood over Mike's body for a second, then one of them kicked his flashlight away, sending it skittering into the darkness. My body finally reacted. I didn't think. I scrambled backward, crab-walking into the deeper shadow behind the concrete bags. My shoulder hit something hard, a discarded piece of pipe, and I fell sideways, landing in a muddy trench dug for electrical conduits. The mud and cold water shocked my system, but I didn't care. I pressed myself into the earth, my face in the grime, trying to make myself small, trying to stop breathing. I could hear their voices, agitated and sharp. They weren't professionals. They were panicked amateurs who had just crossed a line. They argued for a moment, then I heard the sound of heavy objects being thrown onto the bed of their truck. They were still grabbing what they could. The greed was stronger than the fear. Every second felt like an hour. I lay in the cold mud, listening to them work, my mind a blank slate of pure terror. All I could see in my head was the image of Mike falling, the surprise on his face. He wasn't a guard. He was a man with a wife, with grandkids he showed me pictures of. A man who liked worn-out paperbacks and black coffee. The truck's engine turned over with a cough and a roar that sounded monstrous in the silence. Headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the site, and for one terrifying moment I was sure they would see me. They passed over my hiding spot. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel and mud, then they were gone. Silence returned. It was a different kind of silence now. It was heavier, broken. I don't know how long I lay there in the trench. My limbs were numb from the cold and the fear. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I crawled out, my clothes soaked and heavy with mud. I stood up on shaky legs. The site was empty again. The cut fence flapped in the wind. The lock on the container was broken. And Mike was on the ground, right where he had fallen. I walked toward him, my feet feeling like lead weights. The world had a strange, dreamlike quality. The floodlights seemed too bright, the shadows too dark. I knelt beside him. His eyes were open, staring up at the unfinished building, at the starless, overcast sky. There was no surprise on his face anymore. There was nothing. I fumbled for my radio with a hand I couldn't feel. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out at first. My throat was tight. I finally managed to push the button and say the words, "Officer down, shots fired." I repeated the address, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. Then I just knelt there in the mud next to him, waiting for the sirens. The wind was cold, but I didn't feel it anymore. I just felt a profound, hollow emptiness where the ordinary, boring night used to be. The sirens started as a faint wail in the distance, a sound that grew steadily closer, promising a world of flashing lights and questions I didn't know how to answer. But I knew even then that nothing they could do would ever fill the terrible silence that Mike had left behind.